Friday practice in Montreal is over and the fastest driver of the day was George Russell in the Mercedes, as the Mercedes driver was fastest on the medium tyres, which were the C5, instead of the soft tyres, the C6. But what did we learn? Well, in today's video I'm going to be taking a look at the data and doing a data analysis from Friday practice. If you enjoyed the video then please hit the like button and subscribe for more F1 content. Now though, let's get into the video. As usual, I'll be talking about the top teams later on, so please do stick around for that. Yep, Friday practice is over in Montreal, and it was a Friday filled with mistakes. We saw a lot of drivers going off track as the circuit was incredibly dirty and low grip, especially in FP1. And in FP1, we saw Charles Leclerc in the Ferrari hit the wall hard and ending his day within 15 minutes. In FP2, we saw Stroll hit the wall at the beginning of practice, and that hit ended his session immediately, again showing how dirty and low grip the circuit was, especially at the beginning of the sessions. With that in mind though, let's now compare the fastest lap from FP1, which was set by Max Verstappen, to the fastest lap in FP2, which was set by George Russell, so that we can see how things changed between the two sessions. And when you look at these two laps, you can actually see exactly what I mean when I say that there was a massive variation in the levels of grip during practice, especially from FP1 to FP2. And that is because on the exit of every single chicane, you can really see how George Russell in the Mercedes is getting a massive traction advantage as he is able to get back onto throttle much faster. Remember, he also did this lap on the C5 medium tyre instead of the C6 soft tyre, which is supposedly the more grippy tyre. The main area where you can see the advantage is on the exit of turn 9. Look how Russell with the better grip really gains speed on compared to Max Verstappen from FP1. The next area where Russell really opens up the gap is at the hairpin itself. George gets a much stronger run through there and on the exit, showing the better grip between the two practice sessions. At this point as well, the C6 soft tyre is probably just starting to struggle a little bit, which you will see later on when we compare Kimi Antonelli and George Russell's fastest laps. Between the two laps from FP1 to FP2, there was a lap time difference of 1 second. So we've seen how the fastest lap from FP1 to FP2 compared, but now let's take a look at the top speeds that the teams are able to reach, and what can we see here, and who's looking fast and who's looking slow in a straight line so far. Well, what we can see here is that for the most part, the teams are all reaching roughly the same top speed of around 324 to 326 kilometers per hour. There were two teams that reached a higher top speed, and that was Mclaren, rather surprisingly, who reached 327 kilometers per hour, and the fastest team in a straight line was Red Bull, who reached 331 kilometers per hour. Mercedes was one of the slowest cars in a straight line today, and only reached 324 kilometers per hour, showing that they potentially had more downforce on the car than the rest of the teams around them, which could indicate that they were running with, well, like I said, slightly more downforce. If that is the case, I do wonder if some of the other teams will slightly increase the downforce for Saturday. So we've seen how the top speeds compared, but now let's take a look at Aston Martin and Williams, as these two teams look to be, at least so far, the top midfield teams, as Williams and Fernando Alonso were clear of the rest of the midfield today and looking pretty solid at the moment. But how did Alex Albon just edge out Fernando Alonso? Well, let's compare their two fastest laps, and what can we see here? Well, when you look at the two laps and the track domination, you would actually think Alonso was the faster driver, given that most of the circuit was green for Aston Martin. However, it is in the corners where Alex Albon was faster in the Williams, particularly at the hairpin, where Albon was later on the brakes and gained a whole heap of time. Alonso did get a much better exit, but the damage was done then, and then at the final chicane as well, Albon was a demon on the brakes, and it looks like this is the type of circuit, which is all about the big stops, where Williams can really get on top of their car. And with that in mind, they could really be the top midfield team this weekend, but Fernando Alonso will do whatever he can to keep his Aston Martin in the mix. I just want to say, if you are enjoying the video so far, then I would really appreciate it if you hit the like button and subscribe for more F1 content. But now, let's get back to the video and let's talk about Red Bull. For Red Bull then, it was an interesting day in FP1 when the grip was very low. We saw that Max Verstappen was able to get on top of the times, as we so often see when the grip is gone. However, as the circuit grip started to improve with FP2, we saw that Verstappen started to fall a little bit down the order. However, we do know from previous race weekends that Red Bull typically have things turned down more than their rivals. The question is though, for Red Bull, how are they looking on the race runs? Well, let's compare the long runs of Max Verstappen to that of Lando Norris in the Mclaren. And when you look at the longer runs between the two drivers, rather surprisingly, the lap times are very comparable. Usually at this type of circuit, we would expect to see McLaren just pull away from Red Bull in the longer runs. But that doesn't seem to be the case this weekend, and this could give Red Bull some confidence that actually they can mix it with a potentially weaker looking McLaren. But there is still a long way to go this weekend, and we will see after qualifying what the running order will be. For Mercedes then, it was a very strong day, and arguably their strongest performance so far this season, as George Russell was the fastest driver of the day, and Kimi Antonelli was third fastest, putting them in a great position. The cooler temperatures of Montreal seems to be fitting with them very nicely, and we're not seeing them struggle with tyres like we have seen recently. What was most interesting was that George Russell was on the C5 tyre when he set his fastest lap, whereas Kimi Antonelli was on the C6 tyre. So let's compare the fastest lap of both drivers so we can see if it is a case of the C6 tyres starting to lose performance towards the end of the lap. And when you compare the two laps, it does look like that is the case. Note, Kimi Antonelli was faster than George Russell for quite a while, especially early on. You can see he's got a big advantage over George, but as they get to each consecutive braking zone, look at the delta. It slowly starts to go back towards advantage George Russell, and then when they get to the hairpin, George Russell in the Mercedes actually becomes the faster driver, and I think that's because the C6 tyres on Kimi Antonelli's car have started to fade away, and the C5 becomes the better tyre, and George Russell ends up with the faster lap. For Mercedes, they find themselves in a great position, and they look really solid on the C5. The only question is, can they keep this pace up if the competition also tries the C5 tyre in Q3? For Ferrari, they brilliantly moved up to P2 in the Constructors' Championship, but based on performances so far this weekend, it doesn't really look like they will be there for long. Charles Leclerc's day came to a very early end in FP1 as he hit the wall and destroyed the chassis. But I will say for Charles Leclerc, he still finished FP1 in 10th place, despite crashing in the first 15 minutes, so there is definitely pace in the car. Teammate Lewis Hamilton ended the day in 9th place, and was half a second away from George Russell. It's kind of hard to judge Ferrari right now, given Leclerc has had the edge all season long over Lewis Hamilton. But for now, let's compare the long runs of George Russell to Lewis Hamilton, and what can we see here? Well, what we can see here is that Russell went on a mammoth race run on the C5 medium tyre and really managed to make them last, showing that the Mercedes is really working well this weekend. It backs up that they are not only strong over one lap, but also in the race runs, and for Ferrari, they might be finding themselves be the fourth fastest team this weekend, as Hamilton, in his slightly shorter race runs, was still struggling to match George Russell, even though Russell was about halfway through his. Finally, for McLaren then, it was a very solid day, but definitely not as strong as we have seen. Usually this season, we see McLaren come out of the gate swinging and topping the first and second practice session, but they were not really anywhere near in FP1, and in FP2 it was P2 for Norris, but only P6 for Oscar Piastri. Let's now compare the race runs of Lando Norris to George Russell in the Mercedes, and when you take a look at the two longer runs, McLaren does look to be the slightly faster car. But, as I mentioned with Ferrari, it's kinda hard to judge, as George Russell went on a mammoth long run, consistently circling the track, and honestly, it looked like his deg was pretty low. I expected a little bit more from McLaren, and I think we will see a little bit more going into Saturday, but it does look like they will face some stiff competition from Mercedes, and potentially Max Verstappen. So with that in mind then, what are my top 5 qualifying predictions for the Canadian Grand Prix? Well, in P5, I'm going to go for Kimi Antonelli in the Mercedes. P4 will be Oscar Piastri in the McLaren. P3 will be Lando Norris in the McLaren. P2 will be Max Verstappen in the Red Bull. And I'm going to go for George Russell to put the Mercedes on pole position. But those are my thoughts. The question is, what do you guys think will happen? In the comment section down below, please do let me know. And as always, comment, leave a like and subscribe for more F1 content. Thank you all so much for watching.